Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, welcome everyone to today's session, and thanks for joining me. Obviously, this is a fairly topical issue right now, and as I was saying to Dan just before, while we were still preparing, this is an issue I think that our community is particularly lax at addressing, not simply on the individual level, but even more importantly on the community level. And as I'll mention a bit later, I think one of the problems that we have in our community is sheltering behind the good example of a few individuals, which kind of excuses the community from delivering a more comprehensive institutional level, or shall we say community level response to this. And I'll discuss in a bit more detail, but I think that's an incredibly serious issue that we need to face. And I'll say at the outset, as I said to Dan, I don't really know what we can actually do about that. Let me just get this up, this presentation up. Okay. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Great. Let's roll. Okay. So today we're going to talk about slavery, racism, and social activism. We're going to do quite a bit on slavery. Obviously, that's a fairly hot topic. And the reason I've put that first is that, as you can imagine, it touches on both 2 and 3. And if we're going to start with any of these issues, we're going to have to start with the one with which people associate the Bible most strongly. And as we know, people associate the Bible with slavery, and they associate it as associate the Bible with a document which justifies slavery. And of course, we know the Bible has historically been used to justify slavery. So let's have a look at that one first. Obviously, we need to start with the Law of Moses, and before we do anything else, we need to define our terms. This is from one of the standard academic works on slavery, particularly slavery in the ancient world, describing the definition of a chattel slave, that is a property slave. A chattel slave was property. The slave owner's rights over his slave property were total, covering the person as well as the labor of the slave. And Gandhi, this author, goes on to describe how the whole point of chattel slavery is that it dehumanizes the individual and treats them as property. Therefore, there are no consequences for the owner for damaging their slave any more than damaging their own furniture. Likewise, the chattel slave is deracinated, and they are depersonalized, and they are forbidden from or prevented from forming new kinship alliances. Their original kinship has been stripped from them, and they're prevented or forbidden from creating new kinship alliances and through marriage and other social institutions. So they are deracinated, they are dehumanized, they are treated like property, their kinship and identity is stripped from them, and they are unable to generate or form new kinship bonds. So this is the classic form of chattel slavery which existed in the ancient Near East. And significantly, as much as the Law of Moses provided for a couple of forms of servitude, I'm going to demonstrate that it did not actually provide for chattel slavery as understood and implemented in the ancient world. So let's have a look at some of the principles of servitude in the Law of Moses, some of the legislative provisions. First of all, of course, under the Law of Moses, servants had certain legal rights and physical protections. Now, this immediately defines them as non-property. It defines them as individuals. We'll have a look in a bit more detail at these legal rights and protections, physical protections later. But the important thing is that once these people have these rights and physical protections, they are no longer simply property. They are no longer chattel, because property doesn't have rights. And of course, there's no law against, breaking chairs. Very importantly, and of course unique to the Law of Moses in the ancient world, bondservants in the Hebrew community had access to liberty. And again, this is a significant differentiating factor between the servitude under the law of Moses and the servitude anywhere else in the ancient world, and of course in the early modern world, the early modern slavery, particularly of the New World. And we'll look at that access to liberty in a minute. Finally, of course, the servants under the law of Moses had a day of rest every week along with everybody else. And again, this raises the servants under the law of Moses to the same level, at least in terms of their identity, their legal identity, as free citizens. So the idea of giving anybody actually a compulsory day off work was fairly unique in the ancient world. The idea of giving all your servants a compulsory day off every week was simply unheard of in the ancient world. This was unique to the law of Moses. And of course, this day of rest every week, as we know, was given to free citizens, was given to all servants, was specifically extended to the stranger, the foreigner living in the land, and of course, to all of the animals and beasts of burden in the community as well. So its universality was emphasized, and that universality was to demonstrate God's care for those who were in the community, and that's made explicit in the law of Moses. So these are unique provisions in the law of Moses which simply didn't exist elsewhere in the ancient world, and immediately makes the provisions under the law of Moses different to Israel's neighbors. And this is what separates Israel's forms of servitude from those in the ancient Near East. And this is why it is legitimate to speak of servitude under the law of Moses as bonded servitude rather than as chattel slavery. There are some other forms of servitude which did exist in the law of Moses, such as vassalage and corvée labor. Corvée labor actually was enforced even on free citizens. But of course, as academics agree, corvée labor is not considered slavery or bonded, or even certainly not chattel slavery. And likewise, vassalage is not considered chattel slavery either. That operated at a community level and simply meant the entire community was under the, not just the protection, but also under the obligation to serve a ruler as a community. And it didn't typically affect the individual on a day-to-day basis, apart from paying taxes and apart from the fact that the ruler could call on them to be conscripted into their army. So the bonded service under the law of Moses is the servitude that people typically associate with chattel slavery. And as we can see just from these provisions, we can see it was very different. Now, in order to make this point even clearer, we'll compare the law of Moses and its provisions for bonded servitude to the Code of Hammurabi, which was the most widely used and applied legal code in the ancient Near East. So let's have a look at the Code of Hammurabi and compare it to the law of Moses. The Code of Hammurabi, of course, explicitly permitted chattel slavery. And as we'll see, the chattels under the Code of Hammurabi had virtually no protections whatsoever. So under the Code of Hammurabi, there was no penalty whatsoever for the murder of a slave. Under the law of Moses, there was the death penalty for the murder of the bonded servant. Exodus 21, 12 and 20 contains a description of the provision for the death of the bonded servant, and the death penalties inflicted on exactly the same conditions as apply to the freed person. So the free citizen, under the same conditions as the free citizen's life is results in the murderer being forfeit for their own life. So under the law of Moses, there was a death penalty for the murder of a bonded servant, whether that is the master killing them or anybody else killing them. And immediately this means that the individual who is the bonded servant under the law of Moses has the same ethical and legal status as the free person, at least in terms of the value of their life is concerned. If there's a death penalty for the free man and a death penalty for the bonded servant, then obviously their lives are of equal value. Under the Code of Hammurabi, of course, there was likewise no penalty for injuring a slave, and the master was permitted to beat them at will or to mutilate them, either as a way of marking their property or as a way of punishing them or threatening them into further servitude. Under the law of Moses, of course, the bonded servant was immediately made free if they were permanently injured in any way. And of course, the law gave the example of if you knock out their eye, you have to let the servant free. If you knock out even a tooth, you have to let the servant free. And of course, as scholarly literature explains, these laws are exemplary. So it doesn't just mean, oh, you only have to let them free if you knock out a tooth or if you harm their eye. Knocking out a tooth or damaging their eye is exemplary. In other words, these are examples of or summary legislation for any permanent injury. And of course, that's how it was understood by the early Jewish commentators themselves. So knocking out a tooth or knocking out an eye is exemplary for inflicting any permanent injury on your servant. This would include scarring them, for example. So if you beat them and you left a scar, or if you hit them in some way and gave them a permanent injury, such as maiming one of their limbs, then you would have to let them free. And again, this places the value of the bonded servant on the same level as the free person. These people are not chattel, and you're not permitted to kill them. You're not even permitted to harm them in any way that could be permanent. And again, this raises them to the level of the citizen, because the citizen is allowed to be punished in a manner that doesn't inflict permanent injury. The citizen is beaten when they transgress the law. The slave can be beaten when they transgress the law, but in both cases, of course, you're not allowed to permanently injure the individual. So this places the value of the servant at the same level as the value of the life of the citizen. So under the Code of Hammurabi, of course, the life of a slave is less than the life of a free person, which is why you're allowed to do what you like to them, and there are no penalties. Under the law of Moses, explicitly, free and bond lives are both of equal value. Naturally, under the law of Moses, it is entirely legal to enslave others against their will, and the primary method of doing so was simply by kidnapping people, typically people outside your own community, because people outside your community are out-group members and therefore you're free to do with them as you please. Under the law of Moses, kidnapping was punishable by death, and that legislation there in Exodus 21:16 applies both to Hebrews and to non-Hebrews alike, and there's plenty of scholarly commentary identifying that fact. So under the law of Moses, if you kidnapped somebody, if you found kidnapping somebody, then it wasn't just illegal, but actually you could be put to death for this. So again, this demonstrates that under the law of Moses, this particular form of servitude had to be voluntary. And the way, of course, that people entered this form of servitude was to pay off a debt. Now, there is legislation under the law of Moses which says that you are allowed to purchase servants from other people. And immediately people get concerned about that, because it looks like, well, you're not allowed to enslave others against their will, but you can buy chattel slaves from other people and from the surrounding nations and treat them as chattel slaves. But it needs to be understood that when Hebrews were buying those servants, you have to understand why they were being sold. Now, under in the ancient world, the servants which were sold were typically not chattel servants, not chattel slaves. They were bonded servants. They were working off a debt. And that was the whole reason for selling them, so that the master decided, okay, I can't wait to recover my debt. I know it's going to take them some time to pay it off, maybe another 5 or 10 years. I can't wait for that. I'm going to sell them off and recover my debt from them immediately. Now, importantly, the act of sale did not cancel the debt agreement, so that even though the servant was sold, the debt was then transferred to the new servant, but the service was also transferred to the new master, but the service was also transferred to the new master. That is the debt that the new master now incurred by purchasing the servant. That was the debt which the servant was now paying off. And when that debt was paid off, the new master would have to let them go. So the chattels, the slaves or servants which were bought by the Hebrews from the surrounding nations were bonded servants, and the Hebrews master was not only responsible now for treating them better than they were treated previously by their foreign master, but was under the obligation to let them go when they were actually when they had actually fulfilled their debt. And one of the reasons why we know this is because the law of Jubilee and the law of service of freedom of debt servants under the law of Moses specifically says that debt servants who are foreigners do not enjoy the Jubilee. So we know that those servants who were being bought from surrounding nations by Hebrews did have their same bonded service status. They were debt servants, and the Hebrew was expected to let them go after they had paid off their debt. As foreigners, they didn't enjoy the freedom of which was granted to Hebrew debt servants under the terms of the Jubilee or the 7-year debt release. But nevertheless, they were debt servants, and the Hebrew not only had to treat them with far better protections and more respect than they had been treated previously as debt slaves under ancient Near East law, but also had to free them once they had paid off their debt. So we can see that Hebrews did not buy a bond slave, did not buy chattel slaves from the surrounding nations, nor did they inflict chattel slavery on individuals themselves. Likewise, under the Code of Hammurabi, there was a death penalty for assisting or harboring a runaway slave. So the Code of Hammurabi says that if a slave runs away and he is sheltered by an individual, the head of the house in which he has been sheltered or hidden from his master must be put to death. And if you assist a runaway slave, then likewise your life is forfeit. Under the law of Moses, it was the complete opposite. It was literally illegal to capture or return a runaway bond servant. And in fact, the law of Moses said that a runaway servant has become a free person. You are not to return them to their master. And it explicitly says that they are now free to live wherever they please, and they become a free citizen member of the community. And this was absolutely unique in the ancient Near East. So one commentator says that this law, speaking of the protections of the law of Moses for servants, speaking of the legal protections, this law, the protection of slaves from maltreatment by their masters, is found nowhere else in the entire existing corpus of ancient Near East legislation. Likewise, another commentator, on the contrary, explicit prohibitions of the oppression and exploitation of slaves appear repeatedly in the Mosaic legislation. And of course, scholars don't say this about any of the other ancient Near East legislation, because that code, those kinds of laws, simply didn't exist. Likewise, another scholar says Pentateuchal prescriptions are meant to mitigate the causes of and need for such bond service. And I'll get to this in a minute. Resident aliens, orphans, and widows are not to be abused, oppressed, or deprived of justice. So, as we'll see a bit later, the main reason for people voluntarily entering service in the ancient Near East was to pay off their debts. And this is one of the reasons why the law of Moses has specific legislation intended to help people avoid getting into those debts in the first place. We know that the law of Moses did provide for people to sell themselves into service in order to pay off their debts. But it said that after 7 years, you have to let them free, even if they haven't paid off their debt yet. And every 50 years under the law of Jubilee, anybody who is currently under debt service needs to be let go, regardless of whether or not they have paid off their debt. So this scholar says that elsewhere in the ancient Near East, exorbitant interest rates on loans were the chief causes of people being sold into slavery. And of course, the law of Moses said that you are not permitted to inflict interest on people who borrow money from you. And of course, you must let them go after 7 years, even if they haven't finished paying off their debt. Another scholar mentions that under the law of Moses, a slave could also be freed by running away. According to Deuteronomy, a runaway slave is not to be returned to its master. He should be sheltered if he wishes, or allowed to go free, and he must not be taken advantage of. Deuteronomy 23, 16 to 17. And the scholar goes on to say, this provision is strikingly different from the laws of slavery in the surrounding nations, and is explained as due to Israel's own history of slaves. It would have the effect of turning slavery into a voluntary institution. In other words, the law of Moses provided an avenue to freedom for any servant. Of course, it provided several avenues of freedom. You had an avenue for freedom if you were permanently injured. You have an avenue for, or a couple of avenues for freedom if you were a debt servant. And of course, you had this avenue of freedom if you were any kind of servant, either a debt servant who was a Hebrew or a debt servant who was a foreigner. So the law of Moses was strikingly different from all the other ancient Near East codes. It retained the humanization of the individual. It gave them certain legal protections from abuse and exploitation, and it provided several avenues for freedom, which were unique in the ancient Near East. Now, we know it is very true that the Bible was appealed to frequently in order to justify the chattel slavery of the New World, particularly in the American plantations. But it has to be understood that regardless of how the texts were abused in that way, even at a blunt face reading of the text, if you applied the servitude legislation of the law of Moses and attempted to apply that to the plantation slaves, for example, in the New World, in the early modern era, it must be acknowledged that if the law of Moses legislation on servitude had actually been literally followed, then plantation slavery would literally not have been possible. Firstly, you weren't allowed to kidnap people and enslave them against their will. That immediately would have created a permanent obstacle to plantation slavery. Secondly, you were not permitted to permanently harm your servants. And of course, we know that one of the worst abuses of the plantation slavery was the horrific physical abuse that the slaves suffered, in particular, scarring by abuse and deliberate physical branding and marking in order for masters to be able to permanently identify people as slaves and, of course, to identify them as their property. Thirdly, unlike under the North American legislation, the law of Moses did not provide for individuals to be generationally slaves. In other words, that it wasn't possible for you to say that this person is a slave, therefore, in perpetuity, all of their descendants are also slaves, and I have the right to enslave them. And of course, finally, completely the opposite to North American legislation, the law of Moses provided several avenues for freedom and explicitly runs counter to the North American legislation, which said that 1, slaves are not permitted to run away, 2, it is illegal to harbor or to aid any runaway slave. So ironically, even if people had followed the law of Moses legislation and attempted to use that to justify plantation slavery and chattel slavery in North America, it simply would not have been possible to hold plantation slaves in the manner that North America did. So it's demonstrable that the only way that plantation slavery could exist is not by following the law of Moses, but actually by completely ignoring it. Now, there's a lot more I could say on the Old Testament legislation and slavery, and there's more I've actually written, and I can provide that with you later. There's absolute mountains of literature on this, but there's a broad scholarly agreement on this. And of course, as I've shown from a few quotations, the law of Moses is identified as unique in the ancient world in its treatment of servants of all kinds, and there's a scholarly consensus on this. So ironically, there's nobody in the scholarly world who is saying that, you know, it's quite obvious to see where plantation slavery came from the law of Moses, because it's demonstrably untrue. Now, with that as background, of course, I want to move on to the question of the New Testament and the issue of servitude under the New Testament and, of course, in the early Christian community. And it has to be acknowledged, as I'm going to demonstrate right from the outset, that this is a lot more complex. So I'm going to start with the fact that, as this scholar notes, most slave collars we have are post-Constantinian. In other words, when we find bronze and iron collars, which masters had created for their slaves to put around their necks to permanently identify them as their property, it has to be acknowledged that these are well into the Christian era, well into the 4th century. That means that there were obviously Christians owning slaves, not only slaves, but chattel slaves, and marking them as permanently their property. And in case it's not clear, as Glancy goes on to say, many slave collars bear Christian iconography, such as the Alpha and the Omega or the Chi-Rho figure. So we know for a fact that early Christians did own slaves, and not just slaves, but chattel slaves, and not just that, but identified them as property, and not just that, but gave them or exhibited them as Christian, specifically Christian property, in a manner which demonstrated very clearly that they believed this was not incompatible with the teachings of Christ. And we need to be absolutely honest about that up front. So this is a challenge. Obviously, there were people who, in the early Christian era, did not see chattel slavery and permanent servitude, permanent slavery, let's be blunt, as incompatible with the commandments of Christ. And as uncomfortable as that might be, this goes back very early, even to the late 1st century and early 2nd century. Ignatius, one of the earliest Christian commentators we have, says that we should not despise slaves, and he goes on to mention that we should treat them well, but he says neither let them be puffed up. So he says we shouldn't despise and ill-treat our slaves, but we need to keep them in their place. They are slaves, and Ignatius believed that that was just and right. Not only that, Ignatius goes on to say, let them not desire to be set free out of the common fund. That's, in other words, the ecclesial, what we would call the ecclesial collection and the ecclesial funds, that they may not be found slaves of lust. So Ignatius is saying here explicitly, don't let slaves expect to be paid for, to have their liberty set free by buying them and setting them free using ecclesial funds. Now, there's an important subtext to this, which I'll refer to later. But right now, it has to be acknowledged that here, Ignatius, one of the earliest Christian commentators we have, is saying, don't mistreat your slaves. But on the other hand, there's basically nothing wrong with owning them, and he does mean owning them. And don't let them expect that the ecclesia will buy them out of slavery and set them free. Obviously, this isn't a great attitude. It's not the attitude we would hope to see in the early Christian community. Now, in the post-Constantinian age, this was not only expressed at the individual level, but also at the institutional level. The Synod of Gangra in 340 in the early Christian era said explicitly, if anyone shall teach a slave under pretext of piety to despise his master and to run away from his service and to not serve his own master with goodwill and all honor, let him be anathema. Now, obviously, this is the kind of teaching which the later early modern Christians used in order to justify chattel slavery. And again, there's a subtext to this, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's very clear that this is not just at the individual level, this is at the institutional level. This is the Synod of Gangra, so obviously this is a convention of bishops speaking at a high level authority in the churches and insisting that you shouldn't encourage slaves to believe that they should run away, and they should instead serve their masters with all goodwill and expect to remain permanently in slavery. Again, this is the kind of teaching that we find in the early modern era used to justify plantation slavery. Now let's have a look at the subtext. Let's go back to Ignatius for a minute. whenever we have whenever we see admonitions, either individual, and Ignatius, mind you, is a church leader. Whenever we see admonitions either at the individual level or at the synod level, the subtext is that they are attempting to deal with something that is happening that they don't like, but it is happening. Why is Ignatius telling people that slaves should not be expected to be set free using ecclesial funds? The reason is that this was actually happening at this early stage. And we don't get this simply from a mirror reading or reading against the grain of Ignatius. I'll have a look at some evidence for this later. But what's important to notice is that Ignatius is speaking out against a practice that is actually happening in his own time. So a mirror reading or an against the grain reading of Ignatius demonstrates to us, even if we didn't have any other evidence, which we do, which we'll look at later, that at this time, slaves were being set free by Christians using ecclesial funds. And that's why Ignatius knows that certain slaves will start to hear of this and expect that their own master or their own church will do this. Likewise, why is the Synod of Gangra feeling it necessary to condemn teaching slaves to run away from their masters? It's because that's actually happening. In other words, they know that some Christians are telling slaves, you know, if you're in a bad situation, if you want to be free, if your master's ill-treating you, then get out of there, be free, run away from your master, and we will help you. So again, even if we didn't have any other evidence, which we do, a mirror reading or an against the grain reading of the Synod of Gangra demonstrates to us that the reason why this is being forbidden by an ecclesiastical synod is because this is actually happening, and obviously happening well into the 4th century. Now let's go back to the late 1st century again and look at a counter thread in early Christian history, what we might call a minority report. So let's go back to Clement of Rome, late 1st century. Some scholars, actually most scholars, date Clement of Rome to about AD 96 or CE 96. He says, "We know many among ourselves who have given themselves up to bonds in order that they might ransom others." In case that's not clear, what's happening here is some people are selling themselves into bond service for a certain amount of time in order to raise money to buy slaves and set them free. So free people are selling themselves into bonded servitude, which, yes, gives them certain protections, and yes, is an explicitly limited servitude. It's not chattel slavery, but they're doing this in order to raise enough money to set chattel slaves free. Now, I can't imagine a better example of following the life of Christ. This is literally self-sacrificial. There were Christians as early as the late 1st century who had interpreted the New Testament's teaching on the issue of slavery as urging them to sell themselves into limited bonded slavery in order to raise enough money to buy chattel slaves and set them free. Let's go on to Clement of Alexandria in the mid-2nd century, not so much later. Now, this is very important because Clement is here commenting on the issue of slavery in his own era, and he is doing so with the law of Moses. And he's doing exactly what I did. He's saying, you know, even the law of Moses teaches us that the slavery of today is wrong. So Clement is looking at the slavery of the Roman era and saying even the law of Moses teaches us through its own principles of servitude that what is happening to slaves now is wrong. He says the law prohibits those who are in servitude for their subsistence. Note that Clement understands that servitude under the law of Moses was bonded servitude, not chattel servitude, people were in servitude because they were paying off a debt, prohibits those who are in servitude for their subsistence to be branded with disgrace. In other words, to have their bodies marked with identifying features of slavery. And to those who have been reduced to slavery through money borrowed, again, he's making it clear that in his understanding, the law of Moses permitted people to go into servitude only because of debt. It gives a complete release in the 7th year. Further, it prohibits suppliants, that is, runaway slaves, from being given up to punishment. So there's Clement of Alexandria, very interestingly, putting his finger on the 3 points that I noted, which would have prevented New World slavery, the slavery of the early modern period. And he is saying that these 3 points in the law of Moses, if they were followed, would actually prevent Roman era slavery. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it demonstrates that Clement understood the fundamental difference between the servitude of the law of Moses and the ancient chattel slavery of the Roman era. So this is not a reading that we are bringing to the text from a modern perspective or from an apologetic perspective. This is Clement of Alexandria, living in the mid-2nd century Roman Empire, who is surrounded by an environment in which other Christians are perfectly happy owning chattel slaves and marking them with slave collars or even branding them, and owning people as chattel slaves, and against the grain both of his Christian peers and the dominant legal framework and the dominant social historical context of the Roman Empire, Clement is actually using the law of Moses to say that the form of slavery currently prevailing in the Roman Empire is illegal as far as God's commandments for servants are concerned. Now, that's really important because that means, as I've just pointed out, he is interpreting the law of Moses the same way I did, and he's not doing it from a modern perspective or through some kind of enlightened adherence to humanism. He's seeing quite plainly that, look, if you want to talk about servitude and what the Bible says of servitude, the current servitude system, the slavery system under the imperial law, would be illegal under the law of Moses. So he's literally using the Bible to contradict and go against the chattel slavery that prevailed in his era. And this is important, of course, because this is exactly what the anti-slavery agitators did and the abolitionists did in the early modern era. They said, look, even if you want to appeal to the law of Moses, you couldn't even use the law of Moses to justify the forms of slavery that you are trying to uphold. It's just incompatible. So I think that's very important because Clement is explicitly using scripture to subvert the prevailing servitude system of his era. Now let's go on to the 3rd century. Lactantius says the ransoming of captives, that is, using money to buy slaves, is a great and noble exercise of justice, of which the same Tullius also approved. Lactantius is writing not just an apologetic for Christianity, but also advice for Christians. In this case, he's defending Christianity by appealing to another Roman writer who said that spending money to buy slaves and letting them free was a virtue. So Lactantius is attempting to convince Roman people by appealing to well-known and well-respected other Roman people. Then he goes on to say, therefore, it is the appropriate work of the just to support the poor and to ransom captives, that is to buy slaves and set them free. Since among the unjust, if any do these things, they are called great and eminent. So he says, similar to Paul, he said, look, even the heathen consider this is a noble act. Even the heathen consider it a noble act, let alone Christians. And of course, we should be held to a higher standard. So Lactantius, therefore, is explicitly urging the idea of using money to ransom slaves and set them free. And not only that, he's saying, look, even the heathen believe this is a noble act. More so, Christians should. Then Chrysostom in the 4th century. This is quite interesting because Chrysostom goes a step further. And I'm using a commentary here on Chrysostom, just to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting his own words. Firstly, this commentator says, Chrysostom tells slave owners that they should not, in fact, own any slaves. They should attend to their own needs and, like Paul, serve others. Now, this is particularly interesting because here Chrysostom is appealing to the example of Paul. And you can imagine what he's saying. He's saying, look, you know Paul's slaves, right? You know Paul's slaves, the slaves Paul had. Oh, that's right. He didn't have any, because you know what Paul's most well known for? Doing stuff by himself. And and Chrysostom uses the point that Paul always says, you know, I supported myself. I wasn't beholden to any other man. Wherever he was, he did work with his own hands to support himself. Didn't require anybody to support him ecclesially. And Chrysostom's making the point that, see that? You know what that's saying? It's saying he didn't have any slaves, because otherwise, of course, his slaves would be doing that, because that's what slaves are for. So here, very interestingly, I think this is taking anti-slavery arguments even to another step forward. Chrysostom is obviously using pretty much anything in his arsenal he can find, just as Lactantius was saying, look, even the heathen know that it is noble to raise money to buy slaves and set them free. So Chrysostom is using Paul's example of serving himself to attack Christians who own slaves and saying, look at Paul. He didn't own slaves. He did everything by himself. You should be like Paul. You can do all that stuff by yourself. You don't need to own servants. Are you greater than Paul? I think this is particularly important because when Paul tells us that he is working for himself and sustaining himself, he's not doing it to explain why he doesn't own slaves. We know he's doing it to explain that he hasn't defrauded any man and he hasn't made anybody responsible for supporting himself financially. But Chrysostom takes that example even one step further, specifically because, as we can see, he is trying to find anything in his arsenal that he can to argue against slave ownership. And that's important because it's very clear, therefore, that Chrysostom is doing anything he can to dissuade Christians from owning slaves. Not just, you should treat them well, or not just, if you don't have slaves, then, you should buy slaves and set them free. But Christians should not own slaves. And he's finding any argument he can to justify this. Now, if that wasn't enough, Chrysostom goes even one step further than that. Look at this. Secondly, Chrysostom does speak out very strongly in favor of manumission, that is, masters letting their slaves free. Look at what he says. Chrysostom says explicitly, Christians should purchase slaves and teach them a trade so that they can support themselves and then set them free. Now, that is going above and beyond simply buying slaves at an auction and saying, here are your papers, see you later, okay? Chrysostom is explicitly saying, go to the auctions, buy the slaves, take them home, look after them, teach them a trade so they're able to support themselves, then set them free. Now, that's really remarkable. That's going well above and beyond. And it's clear, of course, as we've seen, that Chrysostom is using Paul's own example as justification. And we know that he's even, as it were, taking Paul out of context to do so. But he's doing that because he is so adamant that Christians should be like this. Christians shouldn't be owning slaves. Christians should be buying slaves that they don't even have. And not only that, but should be making slaves independent so they don't fall into slavery again and set them free. This is Chrysostom is actually well worth reading on a number of points. If you want to have a look at what he says about husbands and wives, for example, it is positively enlightened. It is utterly remarkable what he says. Nearly all of his admonitions on the issue of marriage are directed at husbands. Nearly all of them are at husbands, and I can give you some quotations about that. and he doesn't just say treat them well. He says, I don't care how you think you're being treated by them. I don't care if you think you're being disrespected by them. I don't care if they're yelling at you. Nothing they do is any justification for you to be treating them any other different way than Christ would treat you, and Christ has treated the ecclesia. Well worth reading on slavery and on marriage, Chrysostom. Quite a good egg. Let's move into the 5th century, and I'm moving further forward just to demonstrate that even though this is a minority report, it was persistent. It remained in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 5th century, all the way up into the 6th century, this minority report of running against the grain of the Roman Empire's legislation on slavery and against the prevailing Christian practice. So the abbot Isidore of Pelusium wrote to a slaveholder, I did not think that the man who loves Christ and who knows the grace which makes us all free would still hold slaves. Now, that's important because Isidore here is expressing his complete incredulity that a Christian would hold slaves. And Isidore, of course, had authority. He was a local church leader. And this is the 5th century we're looking at here. So even in the 5th century, this counter-argument, this counter-cultural view, minority view though it was still persisting. And Isidore of Pelusium, who's no mean person, is expressing, deliberately writing bluntly to a slaveholder, saying, I don't see how you think that what you're doing is compatible with Christianity. Now, there's another reason why I'm supplying these quotations, and that's because the New Testament is, we could say, strangely, not very loud on the issue of slavery itself, on the institution. Now, that's not to say that it's silent, and I can provide you with a document later on that I've written demonstrating that, very importantly, the New Testament, especially in Paul's letters, repeats all the same points that we looked at in the law of Moses. Treating your servants well, kidnapping and enslaving people against their will is illegal. Paul even says these people will not inherit the kingdom of God, and lists it with all the other vices and crimes. And we know from example of Onesimus, and also from Paul's other words in Corinthians, that if servants have the opportunity to be free, they should take that opportunity. And that's not only still a well-maintained scholarly view, it's also a view which is found in early Christian commentary, that early Christian commenters understood Paul to be saying that, Chrysostom, for example, as one of them, and several others. So it's important because we can see that these early Christians certainly didn't get this enlightened view from the prevailing culture. They certainly didn't get it from the socio-economic conditions in which they lived. And we know that, in fact, the very fact that they were living in a culture in which Christians, especially once Christians were in control, believed it was acceptable to maintain the institution of slavery, that means that these people are even more remarkable. And the persistence of this counter-narrative is even more remarkable. Going on into the 5th century again, Theodoret of Cyrus, Bishop of Cyrus, remarks that when some local soldiers, faithful soldiers, he's talking about Christians, who were stationed in the city, heard that certain Christians had been captured and sold into slavery, or this woman, for example, had been sold into slavery, they paid the purchasers their price and rescued the woman from slavery. So this is interesting because, of course, here we have Christian soldiers, which is another topic which we can look at a different time. When they heard that this woman, I believe she was a Christian, had been captured and sold into slavery, they paid the purchasers their price and rescued the woman from slavery. They believed that this was something that should simply not be. And it's not just simply that she was a Christian. They were under obviously no obligation to do this. Moving on in the 6th century. This is Gregory the Great writing on behalf of a man called Felix, who was a slave. And he's attempting to, very much like Paul, in fact, he's appealing on behalf of Felix and attempting to rescue him from his servitude. Felix, he says, the bearer of these presents, has complained to us that, being born of Christian parents, he was given, that is, he was, the Greek there means that he was given as a slave, by a certain Christian to a Samaritan, which is an atrocious thing to be said. But Gregory, it was just appalling to think that Christians were involved in the slave trade. So again, we're going to return to some early Christian commentary, secular commentary on the Christianity in the earliest years. In fact, the evidence suggests that manumission, that is the freeing of slaves who'd been purchased, and the freeing of slaves who were owned by their masters, was of considerable importance in the economic and social affairs of early Christian congregations. And now we're going to look at a commentary on Peter, a secular commentary on Peter, and see what it says about the general attitude of Christians in the earliest years of Christianity. So this was the general attitude. The Christian slave ought to take advantage of freedom if it is offered, 1 Corinthians 7:21. And in later times, Christians bought freedom from their slaves, but they also sold themselves into slavery to benefit others with proceeds. So this is the early Christian witness. And yes, this is a counter narrative to the dominant narrative, especially after the Constantinian era, which has obviously a lot to answer for. But I'd like to demonstrate, though, I'd like to remind you that even though this was a minority report, it was a persistent counter narrative. It existed at least up into the 6th century. And it was founded explicitly on the New Testament teaching and even justified by the law of Moses itself. Now, it's extremely important that we use this evidence correctly. You will note, as I mentioned, that I started up front, not with these people, but by the Christians who bought, sold, and owned slaves. We can't exonerate all of the early Christians on the basis of the individuals who maintained the counter-narrative. We have to acknowledge the dominant narrative, especially in institutional Christianity, especially post-Constantinian, was to uphold the institution of slavery. We have to be completely honest about that. Nevertheless, it's extremely important to note this counter-narrative, and very importantly, the fact that this counter-narrative was built on New Testament teaching and the teaching of the law of Moses. That's remarkable because they believed that the law of Moses was totally incompatible with chattel slavery, and they had no modern reasons for doing so. They weren't involved in apologetics here. There was nobody that they could speak to who would say, well, yeah, this makes Christianity very attractive to me. Yeah, that's great, because the counter narrative, the dominant social institution, of course, was, hey, there's nothing wrong with slavery. What are you talking about? You know, even other Christians didn't see a problem with it. So we have to use these people very carefully. And a reason for this is that it is all too common for Christians to use the actions of a few to try and justify or hide or conceal the sins of the entire community. And I'll give you an issue close to home. It's very well known and exhaustively documented that the actions of most of the mainstream churches, both in Germany and in Europe and around the world, during the Holocaust were totally reprehensible. Most of the Christians in Germany upheld the Nazi regime and did nothing to help the Jews. Even further afield, most of the churches in Europe and worldwide also did the same. Now, it's unfortunately appallingly true that a lot of Christians these days want to talk about the small number of Christians who helped the Jews, our community included, and hide behind them to say, see, Christians were good at that time, whilst ignoring the actions of the majority. And we can't fall into that trap. We need to be up in front with the poor example of the other Christians. Now, I find this particularly galling because these are the same people who will turn around and say that we are a non-Christian cult. And yet when they want to talk about the Holocaust, they will put us in a list of other Christians just so they can try and pad out their list of Christians who did the right thing during the Holocaust. And I find that particularly hypocritical, given that they will then turn around and tell us to our faces that we are not even Christians. And we need to be up in front about that. And we can't turn around and say that those early Christians who did indulge in slavery, I don't think we should turn around and say, oh, yeah, but they weren't real Christians. I think that's just a complete cop-out. What we can say is that these were Christians who were corrupt. These were Christians who were apostate. These were Christians who were obviously in contravention of the law of Moses, let alone the law of Christ. But you can't deny that they were Christians, and you can't deny that this was the dominant Christian narrative. I think we have to be absolutely intellectually honest about that. And one of the reasons why this is important is because when it comes to this unpleasant topic, racism, we have to be very blunt about our own community's record. So let's have a look at what some early Christadelphians said on the topic of slavery. And just as a warning to anybody, I'm going to be providing some particularly unpleasant quotations from Christadelphians here, and I'll tell you who wrote them. And they contain unedited racial slurs, specifically because I think it's important not to soften the blow. Brother Thomas had an unfortunately poor record in this regard. Not only did he not speak out on the issue of slavery or against the issue of slavery, but in most of his comments, he expressed sympathy for the slave traders and the slave owners. Here in 1865, in one of his diary entries or a letter considering his trip to America, he is talking about the consequences of the emancipation of slaves in North America. And he's saying, he's actually trying to mitigate it and trying to paint the slaveholders in a good light. Saying, well, you know, these slaveholders, oh, yeah, well, yeah, now they're being forced to give up their slaves. And, you know, I don't even hear them complaining about it. They're such good people. I don't even hear them complaining about it. He says, I did not hear a single regret from a master for the loss of his slaves. You know, I bet he didn't. But I have heard satisfaction expressed at having been relieved from the responsibility of providing for them. Oh, there's poor slaveholders. Oh, thank goodness those emancipationists, those abolitionists fought that war against us and finally relieved us from the burden of owning slaves and taking care of so improvident and thoughtless a race. Now, you know, this is the worst kind of whitewashing, painting these honest slaveholders as having been relieved from the burden of caring for and looking after these feckless Negroes who are unable to make shift for themselves. He goes on to say that the loudest brawlers for Negro freedom, and believe me, that's the least offensive term he uses, have proved themselves the most savage of tyrants. So yeah, that's Brother Thomas there. I'll just check. I believe it's Brother Thomas there complaining about the abolitionists, complaining that they're the real tyrants. And then, of course, he so our Brother Thomas here, and again, I'll check with these quotations. I've got the names for all of them. Saying that black people, an honest black person, and we know the term he's using, which I certainly won't grace even with its first letter, in the most ordinary sense, is said to be a rarity. Commenting there here on an experience in America. On Sunday afternoon, on the way to Henderson, met several lots of black people, male and female, dressed in the first style, riding in buggies. They had been to Meaton, and of course here he's deliberately imitating the English patois, the accent of the Negro people. Very pious and very ignorant. They rave at a prayer meeting and come home and steal chickens from a neighbor's farm. So demonstrating their Christianity, of course, is superficial. The implication here is that, well, you can't even teach these people Christianity. You know, they go to church and then they go home and steal chickens from a neighbor's farm. Well, what are we going to do with these people? No wonder they were on plantations. 1891, I can't remember who this was offhand, but I'll find the quotation. I will prove to Brother Fisher by 99 out of 100 colonists, English or Dutch, that a black person will only do good when the rod of correction is kept close to his back. And furthermore, that they are a most unruly, untrustworthy lot in general. But still, I'm not going to condemn them by saying that others will enter the kingdom before them. Rather, the backhanded compliment. So at least they're still human beings, and at least they can enter the kingdom of God, and at least white people won't have preference in that regard. Unpleasant comments nonetheless. Now, it has to be said that Brother Roberts took quite a different view, not just on the issue of slavery, but on the issue of black people themselves. He did not believe that they were inherently flawed individuals. And Brother Roberts' view was everybody is the product of their environment. And if you brought up a white person in that same environment, they would not only look the same with their black skin, but they would exhibit the same attitudes and the same level of understanding. He said that people don't have innate intelligence. If you brought up a black person and a white person in different environments, that's what would shape their character, the color of their skin, and even their intelligence. So fortunately, Brother Roberts was more enlightened in that regard. Couldn't resist throwing in this quotation from 2014 from a talk given by Brother Ron Cowie, who then put this up in a public video, which gained a lot of publicity. Brother Ron Cowie saying, Mark Zuckerberg, he's a Jew, and most corruption in the world comes from Jews because they know how to make money by appealing to human lust. And that's just blatantly anti-Semitic. And the fact that he could think he could get away with saying that in 2014 is just disgusting. And unfortunately, it's an exhibition of Ron Cowie's inherent anti-Semitism, which he's maintained through his entire life. The man is simply irredeemably, apparently, anti-Semitic. And he received a lot of pushback from this. The video actually was taken down, but of course, no apology for his words, no retraction whatsoever. Ron Cowie, by the way, is the same man who believes that there will be some kind of, not exactly Antichrist figure, but some Antichrist, but some kind of Antichrist figure who will be the last Pope who, for reasons best known only to himself, will, of course, be a black person. So he seems to believe in the myth of the curse of Ham, that black people are naturally been enslaved by this curse, and that they are there's some kind of inherent servitude to their position, that they're naturally under the Japhetic race or whatever. So unfortunately, he believes in the curse of Ham, and yeah, of course, the worst Antichrist figure he can think of is a pope who is a black person. I think that basically says it all. Now, let's look again at a counter narrative in our own community, just so that we don't find ourselves completely at a loss. It is true that there's a counter narrative of early Christadelphians, and I'm deliberately quoting early Christadelphians just to show that was this counter narrative at an early stage, who did explicitly uphold Christian values and Christ-like values on the issue of slavery and the position of other ethnic groups. 1871 here, this brother writing in the Christadelphian magazine, utterly condemning the Ku Klux Klan. By the Ku Klux Klan, a private league to intimidate by violence, or who vote against the white interest. Now, note that's very important. He's not just saying they're a bunch of thugs. He's saying specifically that this is an issue of racism. The country is kept in terror, while at its hands, many lose their lives. The evil has grown so serious that the president has been clothed by the Congress with almost despotic power to deal with approved members of the Klan. So at least we can say that at the time when the Klan was in its earlier stages and running rampant with its racism, some early Christadelphians not only condemned its violence, but explicitly condemned its racism. Likewise, in 1878, the notion that black men are a specific creation separate from the white stock is a speculation. It is not supported by the scriptures, nor by true scientific induction. It is natural, perhaps, for disgusted white men to take refuge in such thought, but it is only a thought. It is inconsistent with the Bible. Now, That's far more gratifying, because that is specifically attacking the idea, then prevalent, of course, that white people and black people were physically different. And it's identifying with some irony the fact that white people only believe this because they're so disgusted by the idea of being associated with black people. So there's a lot of good subtext to this. Later on in the Christadelphian in 1904, this, quite interestingly, at the time when the yellow peril was becoming quite an issue, and of course there was an outbreak of anti-Rasian sentiment across Europe and in North America as well. I'm quoting here in this next slide, not from a Christadelphian, but very importantly, a lengthy quotation of a secular article which was speaking out against racism, against anti-Asian racism, which was reprinted in the Christadelphian. So the editor at the time, which I believe was C.C. Walker, felt it important to quote extensively from this anti-racist article about the Chinese. So remember, the words I'm going to show you now are not weren't written by a Christadelphian, but they were published in the Christadelphian magazine by Brother Walker. And this is the article from the article that he published, written by a non-Christadelphian. The Chinese surpasses the white man in the arts of commerce industry. He is more honorable in his dealings, more abstemious and moderate in his private and social life, more solidified with his kindred than any other Asiatic, and for that matter, than any of his European neighbors. So this explicitly anti-racist article, which was opposing the anti-Asian sentiment at the time, gets quoted from extensively and reprinted by C.C. Walker in the Christadelphian. And he provides another quotation. It is for these several reasons that the white European exerts all his stubborn energy laced with racial prejudice to keep the yellow celestial out of his home markets. So very interestingly, Brother C.C. Walker explicitly citing an article, quoting an article against the anti-Asian prejudice, and which even uses the term racial prejudice. So we know exactly what this is about, and identifying this as a racial issue. So at least we can thank C.C. Walker for saying that. He was aware of a social issue, and he quoted somebody in a mainstream Christadelphian organ, mainstream Christadelphian publication. He quoted somebody speaking out against it. Now I'm going to come back to this later, because of course this touches very strongly on the issue of activism. When there's a public issue of racist and say anti-Asian or anti-black sentiment prevailing in the social order, what should we do? Should we speak out? Well, over 100 years ago, Brother C.C. Walker spoke out, and he did so in the community's largest and most prominent publication. And I think that's well worth noting. Likewise, in 1920, aside from the unfortunate use of this word, which I'm not even going to grace with its first letter, it is but a white man's conceit that black people are not their brothers. But they are. The hot sun and the brutal modes of living are bound sooner or later to have the effects seen on the sons of Adam. So this article was explicitly, and I believe this might have also been written by C.C. Walker, explicitly saying that the idea that black people are not the brothers of white people is a conceit of white people. There's nothing biblical in it, and of course, it's demonstrable that black people and white people are the same. Now, note that when the Klan emerged in its earliest years and was persecuting black people, there's an article in the Christadelphian speaking out against it. Note that in 1901, when there's a wave of anti-Asian sentiment sweeping across Europe and North America, the editor of the Christadelphian quotes extensively from a secular article speaking out against it. Now again in 1920, when the Klan is again rearing its head and again persecuting black people, the editor of the Christadelphian in the Christadelphian speaks out against it. The Klan carried on a most infamous and wicked persecution of the poor blacks. Bands of the Klan, hideously disguised, raided the dwellings of the black people at night in order to frighten them and terrorize over them. And now this vile organization has been reorganized as an anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, and anti-alien organization. Now, alien there means anti-foreigner. Now, this is really interesting because the editor here, C.C. Walker, certainly a friend of the Jew, certainly even a friend of the alien, the foreigner, no friend of the Catholic, and yet he includes this. He doesn't believe that the Klan has the authority to inflict physical harm on Catholics. He didn't have to include that. I think that's just remarkable of our brother C.C. Walker's extension of basic Christian charity. But, you know, what have we seen here? The Klan emerges in the 19th century, and a mainstream Christadelphian publication speaks out against it. Anti-Asian sentiment emerges in the early 20th century, and a major Christadelphian publication, the major Christadelphian publication, quotes extensively from a secular publication speaking out against it. The Klan comes back in the 1920s, and there's the major Christadelphian publication speaking out against it. In case anybody's unclear, this is called activism. And obviously, as you can already guess when we get to that third section of this talk, this is the kind of thing that we are going to be coming back to. And a minority report, though this may be, and we can definitely say it is a minority report, at least we can say this is, nevertheless, part of our heritage. And these events are separated, each one, by about 40 years. 1870s, 1901, 1920. So, okay, so 20 years and about 20 or 30 years each one. But at least it is persistent, and at least it is there. Later, of course, by the time we get to the late 20th century, there are even more outspoken articles in the Christadelphian against racism. And I'm quoting from this one particularly, and you might say, well, but, you know, this is the late 20th century. Surely people are pretty enlightened in those days. Well, yes, but you see, this is in 1969. And this is in the context of the civil rights movement in North America, which was certainly by no means unknown to Christadelphians in England. So what do we have here again? Well, what we have here is activism. There exists a certain vague feeling in the hearts of many white people that white skin is better than black, just as good is better than evil. This belief has no logical or scientific basis and is in direct contradiction to the words of Scripture, which teach that Christ died in order that all men might be free. And the choice of words there obviously is by no means accidental. So again, note the date here, okay? This is the civil rights era, tail end of the civil rights era, nevertheless. This is obviously in the context of what was referred to then as the race riots and of the civil rights movement. Now, of course, later on we can find many more quotations. Could there be more striking examples that that discrimination on the grounds of race or the color of a man's skin is abhorrent to God? We don't even need to quote later a modern commentary. We know that Christadelphians, at least in mainstream publications, are explicitly anti-racist, and that's fine. On the other hand, what we don't find today is that same outspoken social commentary, that social activism. And that's one of the other reasons why I use those quotations. Where are those articles today? Well, Christadelphians today might say, well, that's just none of our business. This is not what Christadelphians do. Yeah, we abhor racism. We say that very clearly, but we don't comment on social issues. But we do, and we did. And we did particularly at times when those social issues were hotspots around the world and when they should have been commented on. Now, I deliberately left out our community's absolutely exemplary record on the Holocaust, and even before the Holocaust, on the support of the Jewish people. And I did that for two reasons. Firstly, we know it very well. Secondly, because I don't want that to obscure the fact that most of our anti-racial sentiment, of our opposition to anti-racial sentiment, has been reserved for supporting the Jews. We spent a lot more time supporting the Jews than we have spent supporting black people, even regardless of those quotations I gave from those editors who spoke out against the Klan and against anti-Asian sentiment. And we have to acknowledge that. And I didn't want to diminish the force of this presentation of our community's history by patting ourselves on the back for our exemplary defense of the people whom we have always believed are God's chosen. That's a record of which we can be justly proud, but it doesn't have a place here when we're trying to examine our record of what we have done badly, and what we need to do better on. So it's not that I'm ignoring that, it's just that it doesn't have a place here. And I believe everybody here listening is of the same mind of that, and you'll understand why I did that. And I think that, as I mentioned, getting back to that issue that I mentioned about other Christians hijacking our record in the Holocaust to defend themselves, I think that we have far too often used our exemplary record in concerning the Holocaust and the support of the Jewish people as a shield to buffer ourselves from legitimate criticism of our less than exemplary record when it comes to racism, and particularly the issue of North American slavery, which we didn't do very well with at all. I'm not even going to get to, which is far too long and complicated a subject, the extremely unpleasant history of Christadelphian involvement, and I do mean involvement, in South African apartheid. That's a whole other subject, but it's there and it's not difficult to find. So we need to make sure that we don't use our record of our protection of the Jews as a shield to cover over or to defend ourselves from criticism of our poor track record on racism against other ethnic groups, and our exemplary record of social activism on the behalf of the Jews to cover over or excuse our lack of social activism on the behalf of non-Jews who were in many cases treated almost as badly. So now this brings us to the issue of social activism. Now, I'm going to just skim briefly through these quotations because I'm sure we're all aware of them, but these are the kind of quotations which I've been unfortunately having to resort to in my own correspondence with Christadelphians on recent events. It's well recognized, even in scholarly literature, that from the Old to the New Testament, the Bible is demonstrably socially active and socially aware. And social activism in the Bible is encouraged from one end to the other. The law of Moses had what we would refer to today as a social security system. There was explicit provision for the poor. There was a moral obligation to provide for the poor, and generosity was encouraged even at your own personal expense. So poor people had their debts forgiven. Poor people had a social security system. They had the gleanings of the fields. And of course, we have the examples of men like Boaz who were praised for not just simply obeying the letter of the law, but going on beyond the spirit of the law, telling his reapers, look, leave the corners of the field. And we can imagine that Boaz would have had pretty big corners in his fields, and even drop some food on purpose so that Ruth can pick up food for her family. Of course, the poor were protected from exploitation by the law of Moses. You weren't allowed to take from a man his cloak as a pledge if this is all he has. You're not allowed to exploit the poor by taking their possessions from them, their needful possessions from them as a pledge for your money. Even if you think you're not going to get that money back, the law of Moses says you still have to lend that money to him. And you're not allowed to charge him interest. And you have to let him go in the seventh year, even if the seventh year is next year. Exploitation of the poor, of course, is condemned. Debt relief legislation for the poor. What's the point here? The Bible is socially aware, and the Bible encourages social activism. And of course, we have plenty of quotations like this: defend the cause of the poor and the fatherless, vindicate the oppressed and suffering, rescue the poor and needy, deliver them from the power of the wicked. We know it's no accident that Martin Luther King quoted so extensively from the Old Testament in his own speeches when advocating for the rights of Black people. Open your mouth on behalf of those unable to speak. That is a remarkably modern quotation, or statement, I should say, because that is exactly what people are saying today. Those who are in privilege, those who have a voice, you need to raise that voice on behalf of the others. And there it is, right in the Bible. For the legal rights of all the dying, open your mouth. That's particularly relevant today, I believe. Open your mouth, judge in righteousness, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. And who are you pleading against? Well, we know from the context is you plead with the other members of your community, and especially from the prophets, you plead with those in power. Learn to do what is right, promote justice, give the oppressed reason to celebrate, take up the cause of the orphan, defend the rights of the widow. I'm not even going to bother going on here. We know Isaiah 58 particularly strong. No, this is the kind of fast I want. I want you to remove the sinful chains, tear away the ropes of the burdensome yoke, set free the oppressed, break every burdensome yoke. The Bible explicitly encourages social activism. Now, Christadelphians get concerned because they say we're apolitical, we don't get involved in politics. One of the reasons why I hate that phrase so much is that this is not politics. This is basic ethics. And it really disturbs me when people use the word politics to talk about ethics, because it completely devalues the conversation, and more than devalues it, it even de-incentivizes it. Because people view politics as matters of opinion. But this is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of ethics. This is a matter of right and wrong. And you can't say, well, you know, you believe Black Lives Matter and I don't, and that's just an opinion. This is not a matter of politics. This is just simply basic ethics. This is morality. So no, bottom line here, the answer to Christadelphians don't get involved in politics is this isn't politics. This is exactly what the Bible is telling us to do. Now, let's wind back a bit to those uncomfortable, unpleasant quotations that even modern Christadelphians don't like seeing. Well, we wouldn't say that. We wouldn't be like that. Gee, oh yeah, I know. Well, you got to remember they were members of their, they're members of their own society. That the people at the time were saying that stuff. It's just what people were like in those days. Well, we know, unfortunately, there were plenty of people in those days who weren't saying that. There were even, as we can see, Christadelphians who weren't saying that, who weren't using unpleasant words. Just as an aside, you will find a remarkable drop-off of that particularly unpleasant racial slur after 1900 in the Christadelphian magazine. You find it used almost exclusively by Brother Thomas, a few times by Brother Roberts, and then after that, it nearly vanishes. And I think Brother C.C. Walker only used it twice. Suddenly, you get the Negro. And I don't think that's a coincidence either. Already it was recognized that was a derogatory term. And I think that's really significant. But if we don't want to be those people, and if we want to separate ourselves from those people, we need to think about what we are doing now. Because we don't even have to fast forward 50 years to wonder, well, what will the Christadelphians 50 years think of us now? That shouldn't even be our motivation. Our primary motivation should be, what will Christ think of us now? Not what will people think of us in 50 years' time. Not even what will secular society think of us right now. I don't think the parable of Samaritan could be any more relevant at this point. And the trite phrase, what would Jesus do, obviously has particular relevance as well. We don't want to be those people, those Christadelphians with those unpleasant words in the 19th century. And there's only one way to not be those people. It's to not say the things they did, and it's to not be passive the way they did. It's not to justify with our inaction the things that they would say they didn't agree with, but through their inaction and lack of voice against, they implicitly supported. We don't like looking at the early Christians who explicitly or even implicitly supported chattel slavery. We say we wouldn't be like them. We don't like looking at those unpleasant quotations from those Christadelphians in the 19th century and early 20th century. We say we wouldn't be like them. We praise the Christadelphians who supported the Jews. We praise the Christadelphians who spoke out against the Klan and against the anti-racist sentiment against Asian people, particularly the Chinese. But unless we are doing the same, then what are we doing and how are we different? If we praise them with our words, but we don't emulate their example, then to what extent are we the same as them? Well, not really. And this is the message that we need to send to people. And I mean, I know very much I'm preaching to the choir here, which is why, you know, there are a number of things I could say, which I'm not going to bother saying, because, of course, this audience is fairly self-selecting. But one of the reasons why I'm using some of this material is because these are the arguments that we should be giving. Christadelphians shouldn't be politically active. This isn't a matter of politics. Christadelphians shouldn't speak out against these issues. Christadelphians have spoken out against these issues. Oh yeah, Christadelphians shouldn't be racist, but no, Christadelphians shouldn't be racist. No, but Christadelphians shouldn't permit these things, shouldn't do these things, but no, Christadelphians shouldn't permit these things, shouldn't do these things, and should speak out against people who are doing these things, and should find avenues for activism. Now, here's the point. If we're prepared to help the Jews and not prepared to help black people, then why? And if the answer is, well, the Jews are God's chosen people and the black people aren't, then tell me why that isn't racism. Because bluntly, as far as Jesus is concerned, as far as even some of our early brothers are concerned, the black person is our brother, just like the white person, just like the Jew. And like I said, the parable of Samaritan couldn't be any clearer. Now, I know some other people probably have something to say, and frankly, since I'm preaching the choir, I don't think I could say more on this, but I think these are the arguments that we should be making, and I welcome anybody else's comments. Just as an aside, I think it's kind of ironic that Christadelphians seem to be more persuaded by the example of other Christadelphians than by the example of Jesus. I mean, just throwing that out there, but you know, it's a thing. You've always got to, it drives me crazy that we have to find precedent in our community for doing things that Jesus would have done. I just think it's just unbelievable. But basically, I mean, the message I would send is like, if you say you're not like those people, then I'm sorry, you got to prove it. You got to do it. You can't just say it, you've got to do it. And there's only one way to do it. And by the way, if anybody wants to know, I can tell you all about my social activism here in Taiwan on behalf of indigenous people. I've been to protests. I've been involved in marches. 3-4 years ago, I trespassed on government property against a law which was going to, this was under the previous government, which was very pro-China, which was going to basically allow Chinese government to extradite Taiwanese people. I was there trespassing on government property as gates were broken down, as windows were broken into, as offices were invaded, and protesters actually captured and held a government building for over 30 days. And I was there on the premises. I only left when the riot police came in and the tear gas started. I was taking videos, I was taking photos, and I went and supported the protesters nearly every night for a couple of weeks after work. So I can tell you plenty about my own social activism as well. This is not theoretical for me.
I think that sort of thing is helpful because there's a lot of discussion going on in various groups, a lot of hand-wringing, you know, what can we do in the face of the injustice that we see? And people really do feel like they just don't know what to do about it. So that sort of thing, that sort of practical expression.
Well, let me tell you, and I mean, this is not my own great idea here, but let me tell you what I did. And one of the reasons why I'm telling you is because it's what everybody else is saying currently online. What I did was I visited protesters. I met with them in the area, which was actually locked off when they allowed me in. And I sat down with them and I said, you know, what can I do? That's what you do, right? And what I did was I just walked around. I walked around and I took photos and video, and they said, that's what we want you to do. We want you to do that. They loved the fact that I was taking photos and video, putting up my YouTube channel and showing English-speaking people, because I said, you know, you've got access to people that we don't have access to, and that's what we want. We want you to show this to the people you have access to. That's all you got to do. You got to tell people what's happening here, what we really are, because the mainstream media in the West at the time was just ridiculously pro-China and was painting these protesters as some, you know, disorganized militant rebel for no reason. And they said, you know, you're providing the facts. That's all we want you to do. All you got to do. So I'm not the first person to say this in the current climate. All around Facebook, you'll find people saying, what do we do? And the answer is always, listen. Just go and ask somebody, what do you want me to do? And then do the thing they ask you to do. And that's it. And that's, you know, I don't have anything to add to that. In any situation like this, where you're not a member of the minority who is being oppressed, the best thing you can do is to go to them and say, what would you like me to do? And then shut up and listen, and then do what they ask you to do. And that's, you know, that's pretty much it. And I mean, you want to talk about consequences. I was at that rally, and, you know, not to blow my own horn though, but at any time, if I had been taken aside by the police and they'd asked me for my ID, they could have said, oh, okay, so you're a foreigner and you're on a permanent resident. You're a permanent resident. You're not a citizen. Fine. You know what the law says. Foreigners are not prepared to are not permitted to demonstrate. That's a deportation offense. Okay, and I even went to the extent of speaking to police. I had an ID that I wore on my jacket, who explained exactly who I was. I was totally upfront about it. Fortunately, this police I spoke to were really friendly. They knew I was just there to take photos and video. And most of the beat cops actually that I spoke to, not the riot police, they were thugs, but the beat cops, frankly, just didn't even want to be there because they didn't see the point. A lot of them agreed with the protesters, and they felt that they were being very unfairly treated. When the protesters took over a government building, the minister who was in charge of that very building was commanded, I think, by the president to get the police, to take the police and break in and recapture the building. And he explicitly said, no, that is not my job. And frankly, they've got every right to protest. And frankly, I don't care. And so the police maintained a kind of a vigil on the outside of the building and did not enter. So yeah, I mean, in case anybody needs to know, I've put my money where my mouth is. I've literally risked deportation, which is a pretty big deal considering you get banned from Taiwan after that, for my social activism. And yeah, just throwing that out there if anybody wants to know my bona fides.
John, I don't know if you noticed, there's some comments in the chat there.
Oh, sorry, let's have a look. Help, where is the chat?
I can read it off if you want.
Oh, yeah, go ahead while I'm...
Cool. So clumsy. Pertinent stuff. People are asking for sources.
Yep, cool, yep.
I've got all my...
Yeah, I've got all my quotations.
Yep. Someone responded, Black Lives Matter is a political phrase. It's probably worth clearing up the sense in which you're using the word political there.
Yeah, no, you know, honestly, I mean, this is where
it's the idea is it's not a part, but you've got to separate partisan from political.
Yeah, I think that's legitimate. But you know, from our point of view, and this is the point, I think, when we're looking at this from a Christian point of view, yeah, we don't to the extent of our own individual conscience, we don't get involved in politics. But I think the whole point is we should be saying, I'm not addressing this from a political issue. I'm addressing this from an ethical issue because it is an ethical issue. Because what are people complaining about? They're complaining about, and obviously quite legitimately, people dying and people being brutalized by oppressive regimes. And that's right there in the Bible. It says, speak out against the oppressive regimes. It says, speak up on behalf of those people who are being brutalized, right? And from that point of view, you know, we have clear warrant for treating this as an ethical issue. And the reason why I don't like people, as I say, simply characterizing it as political is because people treat politics as matters of opinion. And what is happening right now is not a matter of opinion. Yes, you could say, okay, well, as soon as you start talking about what people should do, then it gets political. Well, yeah, it can get political, but at the same time, it doesn't need to, because there are plenty of ethical things you can do, which have got nothing to do with politics. And I think we've got clear evidence for that in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that says lifting up your voice on behalf of the oppressed is political, and we shouldn't do that, right? I would say, look, if you're wondering what to do from a biblical point of view, which isn't political, then look at these Bible verses. And if you can find a reason not to obey these Bible verses, I'd love to know it. I just think it's that simple. In other words, you can treat this as an ethical issue because there are clear Bible verses explaining what an ethical response looks like.
You don't want to be tying up ethics with politics, like partisan politics goes, because then you lose half your support base for dealing with the ethical issue.
And yeah, I know. And I mean,
and then you become blind to your own parties.
Exactly. I'm fully aware as well of optics and the need to speak the language of, you know, the centrist or the fence sitter or anything else like that. And I know, you know, we have to be, as with all these issues, we have to be as wise as serpents while being as innocent as doves. But, you know, it's pretty clear as far as I'm concerned what the Bible says on this issue.
So I got lost with the questions. What about peacefully protesting versus dangerous protesting?
Oh, great! I've just got the chat window up here. Cool.
We got it. Cool.
Well, I know from my own personal experience. Okay, my own personal experience. I was at Taiwan. I was at one night, and I'm at this government building, filming people breaking open a gate and breaking down a fence. Okay, and a particularly enthusiastic protester turned to me, who had been helping people over the fence and over the gate that they were breaking down, actually turned to me and offered his hand and said, come with us. I'll help you over. And I said to him, look, thank you, but this is, I mean, especially in the heat of the moment, and caught up with my reasonably, especially at that time, limited Chinese, there was not a lot I could say very efficiently, but I said to him, this is a Taiwanese thing, and it's not a foreigner thing. It's not my thing. This is something you need to do by yourselves. I will follow you, but this is your thing, right? After the gates were opened, everything was broken. I didn't break anything. I was trespassing, yeah, and that was a deportable offense, but I was prepared to take the risk of that. The only thing I did was talk to people, offer them my support, take video and photos, even speak to the police who were there. I spoke to the medics who were there, thanked them for their support, okay? I was there encouraging people, doing what I could. Now, I was treading a very, very fine line even as it was. One of my friends who worked for a newspaper gave me his business card and said, look, if the police ask you awkward questions, tell them that you're a contracted photographer, and I contracted you for our paper to take photos and video. I'll get your photos later anyway, just so it's all legit. But that way you've got legal grounds just in case, the deportation stick gets waved, because what you're doing now, even being there, is super dicey, right? Now, I wasn't waving banners, I wasn't breaking anything, but I was doing everything I could to support people who were activists. And I was doing exactly what they wanted me to do. They didn't need me to throw stones or break things or anything like that. Now, even if I had been a citizen, from my own conscious perspective, I wouldn't have been throwing stones, breaking things, anything like that. I'm a passive resistant person myself. I'm you know, a peaceful activist. I would have been, you know, getting in the way, right? I would have been sitting in front of police and obstructing things passively, like a lot of the protesters did, right? I don't think there's any need for us to stand up and condemn violent protesting unless people get hurt. And then only if we need to. I think if we're going to become protesting violence, the violence we should be standing up and actively heard to be protesting is the violence of the authority against the vulnerable. If we're not protesting that, then what are we doing? And if we are only speaking out against violence by the protesters, then what are we doing? We are doing the wrong thing. That's just what we're doing. We're doing the wrong thing.
Thanks, Jono. I think a lot of the online conversations, there's been a lot of concern that when people start talking about this, that they just get into massive arguments with, particularly with other Christadelphians, and I think people are just really afraid of it's sounding political, even if it isn't, just because it's just because of the argumentative nature of it.
Yep.
I think people get very entrenched, and I think people just really shy away from it sounding in any way political.
Now, sorry, if I can just, I know I'm interrupting you. I'm just going to pause and give you a little bit of ammo here.
Yeah.
So, Gary, if you're talking to one of these people saying that sounds political, okay, quote them some of those articles I wrote from the Christadelphian magazine, speaking out against racial prejudice and racial injustice and acts of violence against Black people, and say, is that political or is that ethical? Okay. What would Christ say? Was Christ going to say, no, fellas, no, you can't write that. Can't say that. Yeah, don't know. Ooh, it's a bit on the nose. I mean, really? So yeah, I mean, Christadelphians have done this before. We have literally done this before. If we can't even speak out from the comfort and safety of our own publication, you know, I mean, we're not asking people to go and tear down buildings. Most of us who are discussing this issue are nowhere near that country that is affected. And we're in social circumstances in which these events are never going to affect us directly.
That's an interesting point as well. I think, particularly as mostly white people, I think we just feel so out of our depth talking about it, but we want to say something.
Yeah.
And I'm not hearing much from America about it. I think that's the concern.
Yeah.
Obviously, John
article from the Tidings
stuff.
was just remarkable. Yeah.
It was brilliant, and
now,
John Popel's stuff was good as well. Yeah.
Just on that point, I know a lot of activists, or for want of a better word, a lot of white activists, especially online, are making a point at, I'm saying this is a white person. Frankly, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, because I think this is the bigger message, I'm saying this is a Christian. Because that's my identity first, okay? And yeah, people can see I'm a white person, you know, I'm one of the whitest people I know. So, you know, I think that speaks for itself, right? But I think that does not need to, it needs to be front and center. And frankly, I think that helps depoliticize that. I'm saying this from a Christian point of view. I'm saying this is a follower of Christ. That's my identity. And I think people need to hear that.
Jono, one view is that that I sometimes see is that we don't need to worry too much about doing this kind of stuff because Christ is coming back soon and he will fix it all up. Yeah,
that's right. Because, you know, I mean, Christ was coming back in the 19th century, wasn't he? You know, I mean, imagine, for example, if guys like Brother Roberts had said, you know, we don't need to speak out against the oppression of the Negro because Christ is coming soon. There's no need to talk about that because this will get fixed up real soon. Yeah, that would have dated really badly. I mean, we just don't find that in the Bible, right? You can strip all these arguments back to, okay, where are the verses you're going to? You know, what did Christ say? What are the apostles? Where are you going? Where are you getting this stuff from? Is this what the Bible tells us? Is what Jesus said? Is this what Paul said? I mean, those Old Testament verses don't say, speak up for the oppressed and the needy until you're pretty sure Jesus is close. Then, you could stop saying that. Now, we got to ask ourselves, looking back at history, at the people that we don't like, and the example of the people who we know didn't do the right thing. Which people do we want to be? Do we want to be the people who remain silent? Do we want to be the people who said, look, it's just not our business? Or I don't think this is related to the Bible. I think Christ wouldn't have been interested in this. I think he would have remained silent. I think he would have said, hey, what about the Holocaust, people? I mean, sooner or later, and if you want to talk about the relevance of the return of Christ, here's the relevance. If Christ is coming soon, we're going to have to answer then for what we do now. And we have to say, Jesus, some of the last things I did, I saw people being oppressed and I decided I was not going to say anything. Huh? What do you think about that then? I read the parable of the Samaritan and I thought that what you were saying was that I shouldn't do anything. And, I should say, oh yeah, that was a good idea for that other person to do, but not me. That's kind of the way I read you there. So when I saw people oppressed and when I saw people in need, when I saw my neighbor in need, I decided it was a bit political, so I didn't want to get involved. And I knew other people were helping anyway. So yeah, kind of how I read you. I mean, is that what you were getting at there? I mean, that's what we're going to have to say. This is not even a question of what will Christadelphians 50 years ago think about us. It's about what does Jesus think about us now? We should not feel that we are being shamed into action. We shouldn't need to be shamed into action. And there are people who are trying to explicitly shame white people into action. And I totally understand that. But this is why I say that I don't launch my arguments from the point of view of a white person, but as a Christian. My whiteness is irrelevant to my stance on this issue. I'm not doing this out of any kind of white guilt or, oh, look at all the power I've got. I don't even have any power. I'm an immigrant in a country with no political franchise. I've been out of Australia so long, I no longer have any political rights there either. So from that point of view, I'm almost stateless in all but name. I don't have any power, certainly in this community. I'm speaking from the point of view of a Christian. And that's the message I send first. It's the same as when I was supporting those protests, and even when I support Aboriginal protests, I tell people I'm a Christian, front and center. And I mean that's exactly why we said when we were supporting the Jews. We said we're supporting this because this is the biblical example. When articles were posted in the Christadelphian opposing the treatment of the black people or opposing anti-Asian sentiment, they were made from a biblical point of view. The Bible says nothing about this. This is blatantly in contradiction with the Bible. And just as an aside, I don't think we fully realize, because of the way we read we read the New Testament, that a lot of what Jesus was doing was what would be considered in his era political protesting. And same with John the Baptist. John the Baptist absolutely excoriated Herod, who literally had him executed for it. And Jesus absolutely poured scorn on Herod, blatantly subverting his authority and denying that he was the king of the Jews. I mean, we might say, oh, but that doesn't look very political to us, but it looked extremely political to them. That's why the Jews brought were able to bring a charge of sedition. And honestly, if you actually even look at Roman history and see what people were brought to Roman courts on charges for sedition, they were brought on to Roman courts on charges of sedition for stuff even less than what Jesus did. So let's make no bones about the fact that in his era, under Roman law, the stuff he was doing was seditious. And the only reason why he, for want of a better word, got away with it for so long was because the Romans didn't see anybody armed. And for the most part, unless those pesky Jews started picking up stones or weapons, they just couldn't be bothered. For him, for them, even for Pilate, he was just yet another long-bearded crazy man who had
so that's a point I've been making in a couple of places around Facebook. People saying, you know, there's nothing in the Bible that says about being politically active or waving placards and whatever.
Yeah.
I point out that's a really anachronistic way to look at it.
Absolutely, totally anachronistic. What Jesus was doing,
they didn't have the freedom that we did, but what freedom they had, they exercised.
They exercised, exactly. Yeah.
So you've got to extract the principle from it.
And you want to talk about political? You want to talk about political? Paul, throughout his entire missionary career, used every legal loophole and legal right he had as a citizen. He appealed to Caesar, right? He said, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. Can't beat me. You can't beat me. He pulled every stunt and trick he could. He appealed to himself as an ex-Pharisee, okay? Even fudging it so much he nearly sounded like a Pharisee, you know? Hey, look, I was born a Pharisee, you know? I was brought up with Gamaliel. Can't beat that, guys, you know? He used every legal and what we would call political recourse and right that he had in the service of furthering the gospel, and not just furthering the gospel, but even literally to save himself, literally to save his own skin, right? He could have said, he could have said, oh, you know, I won't tell them a Roman citizen. I'll just get another beating. You know, that day he was probably thinking, I think I've had enough beatings today. Yeah, don't think I need any more beatings. I think I'll pull the Roman citizen card out. And that's totally legit. As far as Paul's concerned, that's totally legit. You want to talk about political activism? What's that then? If that's not political. Well, it's not political activism in the sense of agitating for a political cause. That is Paul deliberately exploiting his political rights and his privileged social position as a Roman citizen in the service of what he knew was ethically right. And if we can't do that, then why not? If we can't exercise our legal and social privileges on the behalf of the oppressed and in the furtherance of the gospel and in the furtherance of Christ's own ethics, then there's something wrong. And I would need very good arguments to know why I can't do what Paul did and what Christ did. I mean, you want to talk about violent protests? Jesus is known for going into the temple, and we know exactly what he did there. Okay, if that's not a violent protest, throwing over money tables, making a rope, making a whip of cords, you know, and beating people, you know, anarchists love that stuff. I mean, real anarchists, not crazy people. In the chat here. Okay, so you know, I mean, that's the if you want to talk about what kind of activism, well, there's a great meme that says something like, you know, if you want to ask what would Jesus do in this situation, remind people that overturning money tables and beating people with a whip of cords is not off the cards. So yeah, I mean, we got some pretty subversive counter arguments and examples in scripture here. Paul's one, but I mean, Jesus is just like blatantly seditious. And why? And Jesus didn't see that as a political issue. He saw it as an ethical issue because it was. People were being exploited. Now, note that he doesn't just say, you have profaned the temple. You are making my father's house unclean. He calls them thieves because they were financially exploiting people and using God's teachings for financial gain. They were financially exploiting and oppressing people. and they were complicit in the political regime because the Romans let them do that, because the Roman money changers get their cut as well. But yeah, I mean, I would say that if you want to talk about, well, how can I protest? Where are the limits? Well, I draw the line at Jesus. I definitely draw the line. Don't do anything more than kicking stuff over and beating people with cords. Yeah, I wouldn't go further than that. You see what I mean? After that, a few posts on Facebook and a couple of heated conversations online look a little bit mild.
Jono, how easy is it to transfer what you've been saying over to other subjects? Like, I don't know, care for the environment, for example.
Well, I mean, I think the whole point here is it's totally holistic. I mean, you speak out against, I mean, you basically got to find the ethical issue, okay? And I do mean that, the ethical issue, right? I stay well out of Taiwanese politics, even though people know exactly what my views are on the issue of unification, right? And I don't go to anti-unification rallies, right? I am totally prepared to speak out on ethical issues. Now, from my point of view, the environment is an ethical issue because God said so. He said, that's mine. And we know that Revelation tells us that God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And you can look up the Greek, it literally means destroy the earth. It means, it's not talking about moral corruption. It's literally talking about people who exploit the planet. So yeah, I would say find the ethical issue. And you know, you do need to find the ethical issue, and not every fight is an ethical fight. And some issues are political, and I don't think you can shoehorn them into Christian discourse. Like I said, I'm not standing up here saying, oh, as a Christian, I oppose the unification of Taiwan. That doesn't make sense to me. I can say, as a Christian, I would totally oppose the oppression of the Taiwanese people by the Chinese state, just as I oppose the Taiwanese government's treatment of the Aboriginal people.
I've got to go,
and speaking of Aboriginal people, I mean, there's plenty to do there in Australia. Not to mention the US, come to that.
See you, mate. Enjoyed it.
Cool. Thanks a lot, buddy.
No, I might have missed it earlier. Unfortunately, I ran out of steam a little while ago. No, but what options then do we have from a more corporate point of view as to what we can do to support some of these causes for the environment, knowing that it's not just, oh, let's go find somewhere to donate.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, like you and I were talking about before we started, my concern is not even at the individual level. My concern is that at a community level, we are not doing enough about any of these issues. At a community level, if we can't even summon up at a community level some kind of environmental consciousness, which is like about the most obviously biblically related ethical issue, which is like completely mild, you could think about, then I don't know what we could do. I don't have any, like I said before we started, I don't have any great ideas about how to get this from the individual level to the community level, because frankly, in my own experience, our community does not operate well at the community level. At the institutional level, we're pretty broken. We have organizations which aren't taking the lead on this, which should be taking the lead on this. We have ecclesias which could stand up and give an example, but nobody wants to bell the cat, right? There are plenty of people who will talk about things in private, but nobody's going to bring it to their ecclesia and say, we should have a committee about this, or we should be speaking out about this as an ecclesia. We should hold a weekend on this, or have a series of talks on this. Nobody's doing that. And frankly, I don't know how you're going to do that. But honestly, it's not even my business, because I'm just not even in the loop anymore. So from that point of view, not my problem. If you've ever found any way of doing this with any other level, of advancing an issue from a local community individual level to an ecclesial level, I'd say try and follow the same system, whatever you did. But yeah, frankly, I got nothing on that. I mean, at least I would start looking for people like anybody who's running the tidings right now, anybody who's prepared to raise the level to the level of a mainstream Christadelphian publication is definitely someone who we should be talking to. Definitely the Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation. If they are not doing anything on this issue, gee, you'd want to know why. Because, you know, if it's relevant to anybody, it's relevant to them. Might even be worth some of us just like email bombing some of these communities, some of these groups, some of these committees. Ask the WCF, hey, what are you saying about this? What guidance are you providing? Pretty topical issue right now in your backyard. Young people are kind of interested in what your view is. You know, maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. But honestly, if you can't convince your own ecclesia to have a Sunday afternoon talk on this, or raise it at a lecture or something like that, then I don't know what you could do. But yeah,
I've talked about the Bible and the environment before at youth group.
Yeah.
But it kind of amazes me sometimes though, like how you know, our community is so heavily prophecy focused.
Yeah.
And yet people will still you know, like reject climate change and all that kind of.
Unbelievable. I know, it's funny, very funny actually. You know, I was at Mount Waverley, which is quite conservative, but funnily enough, I was given an environment lecture to do, and you know, I jumped in it with both boots, and people loved it. Funnily enough, but ironically, I think a lot of them liked it for the wrong reason. That is, like, oh, look how evil the world is, destroying God's creation. Because, you know, Christadelphians love creation. We're full on board for creation. You know, it's our second favorite topic after prophecy. In fact, I think it's neck and neck sometimes. So yeah, I think sometimes we support the right causes for the wrong reasons. But anyway, yeah, it's just kind of unpleasant that we couldn't see the intrinsic value. But I think intrinsic value is a big deal, right? We should be supporting issues like this because of the intrinsic value. Humans have intrinsic value. It's, you know, not a coincidence, obviously, that I used slavery as an issue and linked it to the current topic. Slavery, racism, you know, social activism in the current climate. They are obviously, bluntly, all related.
Yeah, so the other approach to the environment is that you say, well, yeah, it's great that there's so much environmental damage because it possibly means that the end of the world is nigh.
Yeah.
Whereas the third view is, well, you know, people always say, oh, we're in the world but not of it. But that, for me, that doesn't mean that you just sit back and do nothing. Just
exactly. Yeah, and I honestly think people need to be challenged on where are you getting your example from in the Bible? You know, where is this position coming from? Show me in the Bible, because honestly, on these issues in particular, the biblical guidance is fairly blunt, and the example is fairly obvious. I mean, the prophets, even secular commentary, mainstream secular commentary, describes Israel's prophets as the social conscience of the nation, and how they were consistently used by God to speak out against oppression and to bring the kings into check and to reform the people. You know, that was their job. They spent more time on social activism than telling the future, right? Literally.
Comes back again to what we were saying the other day in that discussion we had about the Olivet prophecy does not end at the end of chapter 24.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
25 contains quite a bit of action.
Well, it looks like we've reached an end point of things here. Much, Jano, for your work in putting all this together, and particularly
Welcome, mate.
2 days' notice.
Yeah, that's right.
Looks like the feedback I've had so far has been generally positive. Even dare I say, this will be up on YouTube.
Cool.
I might, and then we'll close off.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate all your hard work, Dan, especially in your own circumstances and how challenging this has been for you to coordinate. This has honestly been fantastic to see people doing this. And I'm going to be interested to follow up the channel and have a look at some of the other talks as well. Put them on my phone and listen to them on the way to work and stuff. But, honestly, I'm just thrilled that people are actually doing this. This is fantastic. Just brilliant. Hopefully, we can keep this kind of momentum going. I know it's a massive undertaking, which is an issue, but honestly, at least doing it online like this irons out a lot of the logistics and makes it very, very accessible. Hopefully we'll get more people involved and, maybe people connected. I'm surprised I've just chatted a few people I haven't chatted to for literally, 15 or 16 years, which is nice.
Finish off with a quick prayer and then close it off. Father, thank you that we have time here as friends and family to come and discuss things that we really need to be able to make a difference on, that you've shown us about through history and given us examples to follow. Help us make a positive difference in the world around us and stand up for those who aren't able to stand up for themselves all the time. Help us show you and your Son to everyone around us. In His name we ask this prayer now.